Okay, I hope everybody is now on board again. So we have now, or we will have now our next two sessions. The first session will refer to apps on prescription, which is a very current development. And I think, and I believe it's a combination, the question of apps on the one hand and prescription on the other. I'm curious to understand more about this topic. And then we will have, and that is for lawyers also very important, liability and new technologies. This is the last presentation for today, and then we will have the common panel discussion. But we have time enough for our presentations. And I welcome now Pascal Hofer. We've never met in person as far as I remember, and I hoped that we today will meet the first time in person, but it's not possible, maybe the next time, but we see each other. And I'm now, as I said, very curious to hear more about apps on prescription, because we have no new legislation here. And we discussed in the past summer academies the aspect of medical devices as apps, but this is something on top, apps on prescription. So we combine reimbursement issues with regulatory issues here. And now I hand over to you, Mr. Hofer, and I'm looking forward to your presentation.
Yeah, thank you very much, Heike, for this kind introduction. And yeah, looking forward, hopefully the next time in person. Let me quickly share my screen with all of you. Let me know whether you can see it. Hopefully fine.
And maybe you can introduce yourself, because
sure.
that's something that's easier for you.
Sure, will do. So, as you mentioned, my name is Pascal Hofer. I'm legal counsel at Roche Diagnostics and responsible for, from a legal perspective, for all the digital solutions that Roche is dealing with. And part of that are apps, and hopefully some of them will also end up as an app on prescription. So what I'd like to show you is, first of all, in a goal, the scoping of the Digital Healthcare Act. So what's the Digital Healthcare Act about? And then you're going to see there is one main entry point in order to qualify for this very law. And that is, you have to have a healthcare application, or how the DVG calls it in German, a DIGA. And then I'd like to do a bit of a regulatory deep dive. You mentioned it, Heike, it's a combination of software, but also medical device. So let's take a close look afterwards, the changes coming from MDD to MDR. And to make it a bit more tangible to all of you, I have a use case that I'd like to share with you, a diabetes logbook app. You may have read about this in the newspaper, so it's a bit a poster child for a digital healthcare application. Then there is something really innovative of this law, and that's the so-called fast-track procedure. I'm going to show you that a bit more in depth, because that's really new and that's strong. And then we're going to change a bit the perspective. Let's take this perspective of the user, of the patient. So how does it look like for a patient when a patient gets a prescription and then can enter into this digital healthcare application? And in the end, I will try to give you a first outlook and first assessment from my perspective. So is it really a revolution that some newspapers call it? Is it fast track, or as some companies call it, rather slow track? And do we see already changes necessary going forward? Are changes required in the future? And with that, I'd like to kick it off and share with you, first of all, the background. So the background is, as we all know and all experience, many patients already use healthcare apps. And we also see, without having right now clear clinical evidence, or only partial, we still have the feeling the good ones of these apps are really helpful, they structure data, and based on that, a patient can have a better treatment, and also the HCP is benefiting from that. However, there's no clear access to these apps. I mean, obviously, you can go to the App Store, download it, you have to pay for that, but there's no reimbursement right now. And that's the goal of the law. So the doctor will be able to prescribe such apps going forward. And the health insurance will have to pay for it, the public health insurance. And that's majority of the patients, so 90% in Germany. So that's big. For all of the apps, no, only for those that are listed with the Federal Institute for Drugs and Medical Devices, the BfArM. So the BfArM will test for safety, functionality, quality, data security, and data privacy. And only then the DiGA, the app, will be listed and will be provisionally, on a preliminary basis, be reimbursed by the public health insurance, at least for the period of 1 year. And during this sort of trial period, you have to prove, you have to gather evidence towards the BfArM that your app really improves patients' healthcare. And then afterwards, after the 12 months, you have to negotiate with the Federal Association of the Sick Funds, with the GKV Spitzenverband. We know that a bit when it comes to drug pricing negotiations. It's pretty comparable. I must admit, I love this picture. It really nicely illustrates what this law is about. It tries to accommodate two worlds. So one world, if you don't mind, is a bit the structured, conservative approach, which is represented by Health Minister Jens Spahn on the left side. On the right side, a bit cliche, I know, but it's still a nice picture. The agile, bit crazy, fast-paced startup companies. And the law really tries to combine it in a nice way, and the result is what you're gonna see afterwards is this fast-track procedure, and that's new and quite strong in this combination. But who is going to be eligible, or who can pass the entry point to this law? As I mentioned, you have to meet the requirements of a digital healthcare application. So first of all lifestyle apps are out of scope. You have to be a medical device, but only a medical device with a low risk. So only class 1 or 2A. Then your main function has to rely on digital technology. Yes, you can have a certain service component, for example, coaching, but this can only be inferior and a bit of an annex to that. But the main function has to be, or has to rely on digital technologies. Then the third one is your intended use has to be patient-centric. Yes, it can include patient-doctor relationship, but it's not allowed to have simply a software solution for the doctor's office or the hospital. So that's not the intention of the law. The law wants to strengthen the patient and give the patient a certain tool to work with it. The last criterion is that your intended use has to be around diagnosis, monitoring, treatment, or relief of a disease, or diagnosis, treatment, relief of, or compensation for injury or disability. So that's pretty comparable to what we already know from the medical device definition, MDD, MDR. But you may have recognized there's one category missing, actually, and that's the primary prevention. So the law does not include the scope prevention. So these apps are, or software solutions are excluded. How do I now assess whether my software, my app is really a medical device? There are different guidelines. You may have heard of them. One is the MENEF guidelines under MDD on the qualification and classification of standalone software. Then we have now on the MDR the MDCG guidance on qualification and classification. And on a national level, we have a bit of guidance from the BfArM on medical apps. And these guidelines are quite helpful. You find then a decision tree in these papers. You go through it, and for example, if you look at one point, is it only for the intended use only for storage, archiving purposes? Then the medical purpose is lacking, it's not there, and due to that, it's not a medical device, for example. So that's one check you can do in this decision tree. What are now the changes going forward? Klaus Ziel mentioned before, first of all, there's the application date has been postponed for the MDR until next year, so still some time left to properly prepare ourselves. You can say there are only minor adjustments when it comes to the medical device definition as such, and due to that also no significant changes for the general qualification of the software as a medical device. However, there is a tremendous change on the classification due to Rule 11, which you can find in Annex 8 of the MDR. So that leads sort of to a up classification, and that's also complemented by the MDCG guidance that gives fairly good guidance on this Rule 11. And you see that on the right side on the table, it's really up classification. You even don't see class 1 on this table. So most of the software, most software solutions, apps will be at least 2A. There are some exceptions, some rare examples. MDCG guidance paper is having one. It's a conception app, for example. Based on that, the fertility status of a woman can be assessed based on temperature and so on. So that's still a class 1, but apart from that, most of the software solutions 2A upwards. So let's take a look at the use case that I mentioned to you beforehand. Use case of a diabetes logbook app where a diabetic can connect blood glucose meters, and then you have you see your values in a nice and structured way, and so on. So if we read Rule 11, that states software intended to provide information which is used to take decisions with diagnosis or therapeutic purposes is classified as class 2A. So we have the answer. For this very logbook, it used to be a class 1 under MDD. It's now up classified to 2A under MDR. And you may also know for some software and apps, there can be a modular approach, some software architecture where you can have different modules and they may belong to different medical device classes. So we give you also here an example for such a logbook app. The logbook app, as I mentioned, 2A. But if there is on top something like a bolus calculator, which is something for diabetics to calculate insulin dosage, and then adjust the therapy and apply this insulin dosage, this can be quite risky to your health. And due to that, and you read it also in Rule 11, then you go to class 2B with this bolus calculator. And you may also recall that's not part of the DVG, so 2B is too high. So the DVG wanted also only to include minor low-risk classes for medical devices. But I'm going to show you in the end the solution how you can include also higher risk classes. So what are the other application requirements if you want to have an app listed with the BfArM? On the left side, you see you have product performance, safety, quality, data privacy, and data security. The good news now is that with your CE mark, you have already proven product performance and safety. So the BfArM will only ask for additional documentation papers in case of doubt. So the normal pathway there is you have your evidence with the CE mark. For quality, data privacy, data security, things are different. You're gonna find extensive questionnaires which are attached as attachment 1 and 2 to a regulation under the law. And you have to go through this catalog. I have a snippet for you on the next slide. I'm going to show you how this works. On the right side, you see, and that's something that most companies, they feel that this is the real burden, the cost driver, the pain point of this law. You have to prove in a very robust way care improvements. And there are two routes you can choose. Either you go for medical outcome, or you go for structural, procedural improvements for the patient. The latter can be, for example, patient adherence, so that a patient is compliant with the therapy program, or that you prove that the patient is more empowered when it comes to this solution. My impression right now is most companies will rather go for this pathway, to prove structural, procedural evidence, because that will be, is my impression, way easier than the medical outcome. You're also free to combine these approaches, have also some medical outcomes, some structural, and then perhaps you're on the safer side. That's also possible to combine these. Here, as I mentioned to you, it's a snippet out of a very extensive questionnaire on data privacy. You have to go through this questionnaire and tick all the boxes. Perhaps if you've ever been involved in a tender procedure, it's a bit comparable. It reminds me of really a tender situation where you have to go through it and declare yourself, and most of them are knockout criteria. So you really have to tick the box, I can deliver. There are only rare examples where you can say not applicable or I can't deliver, and then there is a certain exception to that. For most of them, you clearly have to do the self-declaration, I am in the position to deliver on that. Let me guide you through this application process, what the law calls fast track, or the guideline of the BfArM calls it fast track procedure. So how does it look like? Let's start from left going to right. So you, as a legal manufacturer, first of all, that's also a bit of an agile and new approach. You can actually talk to the BfArM. So you can send questions to the Digital Innovation Office to them. They will prepare themselves, they will give you a time slot, and they will advise you then on your questions and your topics. There's also, unfortunately, a fee attached to that mostly, and depending on the complexity of your question, it's a higher fee or lower fee. Once you have made your mind up how you want to apply, you hopefully deliver your full application to the BfArM. And then you have to decide right away, do I go for the full and final listing, which is the upper pathway, the first pathway that you see on the head. That's only possible if you have all the evidence on the positive care outcome. I don't think most companies will have that, because really you have to have robust data. So a bit of real world data that most app companies have, that's not enough. Really a robust data is necessary, a real robust study concept. So most companies will go for what I mentioned to you, the preliminary listing, and that's in the middle. The BfArM will have to decide, once they received your full documentation within 3 months. The very good and charming thing about this fast track is, once the BfArM decided upon your preliminary listing and you are provisionally listed, then you get right away reimbursement. And you have also the possibility in principle to set your pricing during these 12 months, the first trial period. And during these first 12 months, you have to then gather the evidence of your study. And then in the end of the 12 months, the BfArM will decide finally if you have now enough evidence, if it's strong, robust enough to prove the medical outcome or the structural, procedural evidence. Then you can approach, or the GKV Spitzenverband will approach you, and there's a certain pricing negotiation and hopefully a price in the end. If there is disagreement, then there is an arbitration procedure, and then there will also be a solution when it comes to the pricing. Let's change a bit the perspective. So that was the perspective for the legal manufacturer in the application process. How does the process might look like for a patient? So as you may know, for apps, there's often some sort of freemium version so that you can enter or download an app and have it right away without any fee. So at least a basic version. That's this freemium model. So if you see it, the user signs up, then you have a certain trial period or whatsoever. Then if the app is created hopefully in a smart way, you get a communication that there is a good law in place, and you may visit your HCP and you hopefully also get a prescription. And then at some point you get, after the prescription, also the activation code for the app. That's still not entirely clear how this will work, but you will get it. And it looks like you will get it from your health insurance, either via telephone or via post or via an app that is provided by the health insurance. Then you, as a patient, you have the activation code, you enter it into the app, and then the DVG version is enabled. I mentioned to you there might be also other modules that have a higher risk class, and due to that, it's not part of the DVG version. Yeah, but then that's the part with this enables BC. That's again the placeholder for other modules like a bolus calculator, which a higher risk class is associated with. So the BfArM is pretty clear on that. It's possible for a patient that they can enable these modules on top, but you have to include a disclaimer that says, well, that's not part of the DVG, of the Liga version, and you are aware of that. Then the patient has to press the button, and then also additional modules can be enabled. So I think it's a good solution, not ideal, but okay. Then also, if the app is created in a good way, you get a certain reminder if the prescription of the doctor runs out, comes to an end, and then the patient can again go to the doctor and ask for another prescription. And with that, I'd like to wrap it up, give you a bit of an outlook, a first assessment. So some claimed it's a revolution, this law. You see it already. I rather tend to think it's an evolution. Yeah, it nicely fits into our way into the digital era. But we had already some examples in the past, so it's not really revolutionizing. You see also, if you look into France, they have a program which is called ETAP, where they combine software and hardware. You have the NHS in the UK, they have also tenders combining hardware, software. So we have examples, but which is really new, that there is a law giving all publicly insured patients a right to get apps. So that's new, that is strong, and gives really strong positions to patients. The second one, is it fast track, or as some companies say, it's onerous, so we feel it's rather slow track? Typical lawyer answer, it depends. It depends on how you look at it. If you look from a rather drug perspective, I think it's way faster than for pharmaceuticals. But also, if you look at it from a more general objective perspective, it's still very fast. I mean, due to this hybrid version of preliminary listing, I think that's a very good and nice approach, that you get directly reimbursement after the decision of 3 months of the BfArM. I think that's really slow, really fast track. So what will change going forward? Hopefully we get a bit more clarification on things like study concept and how to gather robust clinical evidence that's also fitting into this app and startup world, because that can be quite onerous for startup companies also now to get investment for a clinical study that can easily cost 500,000. So hopefully a bit more clarification on that. And then also, hopefully the law will also comprise higher risk classes, like what I mentioned to you, the class 2B, because ultimately the law wants to help the patient, support the patient, and you can really support the patient in the best way in providing all the package that is needed and not only part of it, because it's only now 2A or class 1. Yes, and with that, I'd like to thank you very much for your attention and very much looking forward to further questions in the discussion.
Mr. Hofer, thank you very much. That was so interesting. And as I said, I was curious to learn more about the combination of regulatory questions and reimbursement questions. Before we discuss other questions, my focus is, we all know how hard it is to compile all those data which are necessary for the clinical evaluation of a medical device as such. If we have, as you said, on top these additional need for data, I believe it's in practice not so easy to find the correct design, which is accepted by BfArM and our public insurance, which then gives evidence on those preconditions. And is it possible to plan studies which cover the performance and safety for the medical device part, as well as can we use those data also for the additional question of medical outcome or structural outcome? Is it possible to combine both? What do you think?
That's a very good question. I think going forward, if you really have already in mind that you should fulfill both requirements, so not only the medical device conformity assessment, but also performance afterwards with the BfArM, and then having pricing negotiations with the GKV Spitzenverband. I think it's possible if you design it properly right away. But here with this law, I mean, it came at a later point in time, and then it was not possible to properly prepare. But I think it's a smart idea.
If you, for example, have if we have a development from the beginning, it would be worth for companies to think about this aspect, because then they have the opportunity to cover the most aspects, not only the medical device or regulatory aspect. And this could help. I know this discussion from medicinal products, drugs, because there we have the benefit assessment with regard to the public insurance and pricing. And they have similar problems because they can often not use the clinical trial data for the safety and efficacy of the drugs for the same purpose of reimbursement and pricing, and to give evidence on the additional benefit. And this is often, as you said already, an additional investment and linked with a lot of risks for the company.
Yeah, no, I fully agree. I think that's a very smart approach, if foreseeable, to combine it right away, these aspects.
Okay. Okay, so do we have additional questions? I don't see a hand currently.
And I don't see anything in the chat yet, but I would have a question.
Yes.
This new legislation, it's young. It has been in place, I don't know, a couple of weeks or months only. So maybe do you, Mr. Hofer, or anybody else in the group have information about practical applications. Does, for example, the bee farm give information on how many apps are in the process of being tested by them? And another maybe similar questions, you mentioned that most apps will be class 2A or higher, so that implies they will need a notified body. With everything we heard from Mr. Thiel today, we know that notified bodies have a lot to do right now. So is there enough capacity with notified bodies to actually care about this new legislation and care about apps, or is there a bottleneck? Any comments on that by anybody?
I'm happy to take your first question. So the BfArM was asked how many legal manufacturers have already issued an application. They didn't disclose. The thing they shared is that they already received end of May complete applications. So that means that we're gonna see end of September, beginning of October, the first apps that can be prescribed.
Okay, thank you.
You're welcome.
Okay, I have an additional question, but maybe it's also connected with the question of Dirk Hemsmeyer. I know that we discussed in our life science group here in the north of Germany in the past the class 1 medical devices and the up classification of the software. So in case, so I saw, and we all know that there are almost no software or apps available which are class 1 or can be classified as class 1. Why? What is the reason that the regulation refers to class 1? Only to close this gap, or is there no awareness that class 1 will be not included in the applications? Because if there is no class 1, the question is, why didn't they then focus more on class 2B? Because they know the situation that I don't know any app which is class 1. According to the new rules we have. So what is the reason why they cover class 1? Is it only for that it looks a lot of, that these are a lot of apps, or is it only to close the gap and to cover only those two classes?
Yeah.
Do you know the
I think
background?
Yeah, it was just to conversely to exclude the higher risk classes to 2B and 3. And that's why conversely they said, well, include class 1, even though it's perhaps rather theoretically, and 2A is the practical example.
Yeah. Okay.